My next very welcome guest is Leith Van Onselen, the unconventional economist who is from Macro Business Australia. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me.
And we're delighted to have you from Macro Business because it is such an interesting organisation. What it produces is well worth reading. Macro Business is Australia's leading business and investment blog. Its mission is to bridge the gulf between Australian business, media and reality. That this gap exists without the heavy hand of a dictator is testament to the power of vested interests, monopolies, weak government, closed ideologies, and a perennial culture of populism. In effect, it means our leadership class can make unaccountable economic and business blunders while being measured against inappropriate yardsticks. At Macro Business, they measure the economy and the elite against the lessons of history, reason, and ideas to provide a better discussion for investments and business. Macro Business posts are driven by the Australian national interest. They are fact-checked, data-driven analysis and opinion, and they say on their website, if they get it wrong, we own up to it. And occasionally they are satirical. The posts are, in brief, excellent, and I find them very informative. So, Leith, on the basis of that, what is your view of the budget?
Look, David, to be quite frank, I believe it was I'd label it a Band-Aid budget. So obviously the signature policy measures that were announced on Tuesday night were the cost of living relief that the government's going to hand to us using our money in the form of rental subsidies and energy bill relief and those sorts of things. And look, most of the conjecture around these subsidies has surrounded whether or not they're going to add to inflation and those sorts of things. To cut a long story short, I think they'll, not have a lot of impact at all. They'll slightly bring down inflation in those areas, but they might increase inflation marginally through second round effects when people spend the money. So it's really, it's not going to have a lot of impact. But this doesn't mean that the subsidies are, okay policy. They're not. And the reason why I think they're very poor policy is because they don't address the underlying policy failures that have caused the cost of living problems in the first place. And the government's effectively using our money, taxpayers' money, to band-aid over the problems that it itself has created. So, for example, I'll give you two areas of example. First is the rental subsidies. So we all know that the rental crisis in Australia, and the reason why we've got soaring rents and soaring cost of living in the areas of rents, is because the federal government is running an absolutely massive, unprecedented immigration program. And that's driven rents through the roof, and it's forced people to live into group housing and homelessness and pay extraordinary amounts of money for their rents. So in order to relieve that rental crisis, the federal government is using our money to then try and subsidise rents for low-income earners, rather than, instead of not creating the problem in the first place by running such an absurd immigration program. Now, the same can be said for energy subsidies, David. So as I've said repeatedly on your show, Australia is an energy superpower. We are drowning in gas. We are drowning in coal. We have so much of it. We export just about all of it overseas. We use very little domestically in comparison. We should have the cheapest energy prices in the world. But through policy failure, we have expensive energy that's basically driven up households' cost of living. It's also sent manufacturing industry broke. And just in the last month, we've seen four manufacturing firms. Qenos, which was Australia's last plastics manufacturer, has now exited because of high energy costs. We've also seen warnings from Orica, which is Australia's explosives manufacturer, as well as Nestle and PepsiCo, who have all warned that Australia's energy costs are simply too high and it can't afford to do business in this country, and they're threatened to leave. And this has all been brought to you because our idiotic federal government hasn't reserved gas for domestic use on the East Coast. We don't tax our foreign-owned energy corporations nearly enough. And as a result, we're left with, not enough tax revenue, while we also pay these ridiculous global prices for gas, which then feeds electricity prices, despite the fact that we are one of the world's biggest exporters of energy. Now, we should have the cheapest energy prices in the world, or among the cheapest energy prices in the world, and instead we've got expensive energy. And as a result, our cost of living has been driven up, and we've made our industry uncompetitive. And the government's solution to that, instead of fixing the underlying problem, which is its broken energy policy, it's now going to use our money, taxpayer money, which has gotten through our over-reliance in personal income taxes, for example, to then give some of that money back to us to artificially cover up its energy failures. And I think that is my main problem with this budget. It is a Band-Aid budget.
You say that we depend too much on income taxation, so I assume you'd be looking at taxes on goods as another alternative. Why isn't the GST is supposed to replace state taxes? Why was it established in such a way that there is a socialist element in it? And there's this idea that you have to have the same level of service across the different states. So some states get more than they collect, and other states end up with a much smaller amount than they would be getting if the GST just came from their state. Why do we have that principle of rewarding those states which have poor governments?
Yeah, look, I mean, it could obviously lead to problems in that we reward states like Victoria who, for example, don't want to develop their gas resources. We do have gas resources in Victoria, but they refuse to develop them and they put a ban on future gas resources. And as a result, Victoria has cried poor to the federal government saying, oh, we don't have energy resources, so we should get more GST. And they got rewarded with an extra, 3.8 billion of GST. So it can reward that sort of behaviour. But on the flip side, we don't really, I personally don't want to see states like Tasmania, which residents there suffer with, inferior services and et cetera, versus, say, Western Australians who are swimming in resources, et cetera. So, there is an element of rewarding incompetence, but at the same time, there is also an element of equity. My bigger concern around GST, David, is that it is a diminishing tax base and it's not set high enough. So we've obviously set the GST at 10%. The problem with that is that the areas of expenditure that grow the fastest, so for example, expenditure on health and education, are excluded from the GST. And what that's meant is that the states are basically fighting over a shrinking revenue pie. So GST's revenue as a share of total taxation revenue in Australia is shrinking. And it's shrinking because the areas that grow the fastest in expenditure are excluded from the GST. I think there's, one of the solutions to Australia's tax problem, where it's wholly reliant on personal income tax, is to lift the GST, so have higher consumption taxes. But more importantly, we need to tax our resources properly. Like, Australia could be swimming in taxation revenue if we copied Norway and we did what Norway does, where it taxes its resource base properly. So I've said this before in the show, David, Norway taxes its oil and gas industry at about 80%. So part of that's because a lot of their gas and oil producers are publicly owned, they're not private, but even the private ones get taxed at a very high rate. And what it's done is it's effectively made Norwegians the richest people on earth. A country of 5.5 million people is now sitting on a sovereign wealth fund, which has been born from its, oil and gas riches, worth about $250,000 per resident. Now, Australia could have had that. We could still set up something like that. And that would mean that we're not so reliant on personal income taxes if we taxed our resources properly. But unfortunately, we have fluffed it over and over again. And instead, we have the opposite. We don't tax our energy and resources properly. So we're starved on taxation revenue. Then we also make the mistake of effectively not reserving these resources for our own use, so that we then have very high domestic energy prices, for example. And then to make matters worse, the solution, because we're so highly reliant on personal income taxes, the government's solution is to import huge amounts of people from overseas so we can import taxpayers, rather than shifting the tax base to make it, not so reliant on income. And I tell you this, David, Norway would be a lot poorer place if it doubled its population to 11 million people, because its resource riches would be diluted by half, right? So instead of the sovereign wealth fund being worth $250,000 per citizen, it'd be worth $125,000. In Australia, we don't have the sovereign wealth fund set up, but we then dilute what little mineral wealth we have left that we get through corporate taxes. among more people by running this mass immigration program. It is completely back to front what we do in Australia. And if we taxed our resources properly, there would be a direct incentive not to grow the population so quickly, because that would make you poorer directly.
There also is the problem is that so much of the taxation is taken by the Commonwealth. Commonwealth, I think, takes about 80%.
82%, yes.
It's extraordinary. And no other federation does this. The idea that they take taxes and then they hand them back to the states with instructions on how to spend it, it takes away all the advantages of a federation, because the advantages of a federation surely are each state trying to be more attractive to investors than the others.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, this stretches back to World War II. So when the Second World War was declared, the states lost their income taxing power. They gave it to the feds to, fight the war. Unfortunately, it never reverted back. And as you said, the Commonwealth collects about 82% of the taxes. The state and local government only collect 18%. And the problem with it is it's led to all these perverse outcomes. So, for example, I always harken back to it, but immigration is a classic example. The federal government loves a high immigration program because it brings in extra taxpayers. And because it gets, 82% of the taxes through primarily personal income taxes and company taxes, and those two areas get expanded when you have more people in the economy, booting up business profits and also working, the federal government sees immigration as just a win in their book. The problem is the costs of immigration then go on the state governments, who do not collect the tax revenue. Like they collect it a little bit through stamp duty, but effectively the feds get all the benefits from immigration, whereas the costs then get laid onto the states and the local governments, who then have to provide the infrastructure, the services, the schools, the hospitals, all those sorts of things. And this is, again, if the federal government was required to bear the cost of immigration and not just get the benefits, I guarantee you we'd have a lower immigration program. But because of the busted incentive system we have here, that's why the federal government runs such a high immigration program, because all it sees is dollar signs.
We seem to very quickly take on any new idea from the United States, including new ideologies which come out of the American universities. I'm wondering if this idea of out-of-control immigration also comes from the Democrat government in the United States, which opened the southern border, which Trump had closed, and they seem to have uncontrollable immigration in the United States through the southern border. One of the arguments is that not only do you get more taxpayers, you also get more voters, and the voters will be grateful to the party that let them in. Do you think that is a relevant consideration?
Yeah, and not just that, you can also, in Australia's case, the Australian Treasury also loves immigration, not just because of the tax impact, which is, all beneficial. It also allows them to claim that Australia has avoided a recession. So a classic example now is Australia's per capita GDP growth fell by 1% in the year to December, so last calendar year. But the overall economy continued to grow because we had population growth of 2.5%. So it's away from the paper over, a weak economy, a structurally weak economy, and to make it look better than it naturally is. Meanwhile, individual living standards continue to slide backwards. And, to your point, yes, the US has a lot of illegal immigration through, through the southern border, but their immigration rate overall pales into insignificance against ours. Like ours is a lot higher, but probably a worse example of the immigration open borders craziness is actually Canada. So Canada received just over 1.2 million net overseas migrants last calendar year, which was just for a country of 40 million people, that is an absolutely extreme rate that makes ours look small. And they have all the same problems of, terrible productivity growth, a housing crisis, extreme rental inflation, and an economy that is going backwards in per capita terms, very quickly, even though the overall economy is still growing because of the strong population growth. So Canada is, basically a window into our future if we keep going down this road.
Do you think the Treasurer's projections on inflation hold much weight?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the the projections on inflation have actually come about. And Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, said that one of the drivers behind that lower inflation forecast is actually that the government wants to halve the rate of immigration. So that there was a tacit acknowledgement by the Treasurer that its record immigration has actually pushed up Australia's inflation. And you see that mostly through the rental market. Yeah, that's the most obvious place. Look, it's certainly possible. I think it is actually a realistic, scenario if they do cut immigration back to about 250,000, which is their plan, which is still ridiculously high. Like that is a historically high rate of immigration. But in terms of, when you're coming down from 550,000, it's you're obviously gone from here to here back to here, but here was still higher than the historical average, which is down there. So it's still too high. But yeah, I think it is possible. Also because we have a weakening economy. So all the data that's come out since the shock CPI release last month has been terrible. So we had retail sales came out last week. They've fallen by about 6% in real per capita terms since mid-2022. So retail sales are crashing. The number of applicants per job ad recorded by SEEK is now running nearly 60% higher than pre-pandemic. So we've got all these extra people competing for a diminishing share of jobs. Yes, Wednesday's wage price index was weak, and it showed that real wages are falling again. And also the NAB business survey that was released this week was terrible. So it basically showed weakness across pretty much all areas. So, for example, it was the NAB's business survey said that the economy recorded slower economic activity, slower jobs growth, lower labour costs, and lower inflation. And it actually suggested that the per capita recession that we're suffering right now has actually worsened in the March quarter. So I think based on all those things, a slowing economy, et cetera, I think those inflation forecasts from the federal budget probably, might be realistic.
No wonder many commentators see this as an indication of an early election. Leith Van Onselen, once again, thank you very much for the common sense which you offer to our audience. Thank you.
Cheers, David. Thank you.